Well, you will begin this meeting, and welcome to everyone. Welcome to this fourth session of the Diwan lectures organized by Sorbonne University and in partnership with the French Resource Center in Arabian Peninsula, the CEFREPA. We are very happy today to welcome Professor Eugene Wong, and she will talk about the Chinese community in the UAE. Thank you, Professor, to be here with us. One of the first one session that is on campus, that is in reality. So Professor Eugene is presently teaching at she's teaching sociology in the American University of Sharjah. Her research is mainly focused on Islam and Chinese Muslims, transnational religious networks, social change in the Arabian Gulf, the Chinese expatriate community in the UAE, and the relations between China and the UAE. Her last book in 2020 was dedicated to the situations of the Chinese in Dubai and was entitled Chinese in Dubai, Money, Pride, and Soul Searching. Professor Eugene will speak today about China's expatriate community in the UAE, stressing on the opportunities and the challenge the community is facing now. After our lecture, we have time to engage a discussion with her, and it will be great. The meeting is also online, and the people online, the audience online, can send questions by the chat window. We will give you the opportunity to speak directly with our guests if you wish. Before we begin, I also want to thank Dr. Clio Chavenot, Associate Professor of Sociology at the Sorbonne University, who organized this session with me and kindly agreed to be the moderator today. Thank you, Clio. So let us begin the meeting. Dear Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to see people in real space. It's been 2 years. I was just talking to Dr. Clio for me actually to present my research in a face-to-face manner. I actually have waited for a long time and to re-engage with the Sorbonne community. The first time I visited Sorbonne was back in 2011. So just to give a little bit of background information about myself, so you know why I became interested in the research topic, and then how I'm approaching to this topic, and then how this has actually shaped my research agenda in the last decade. So the first time I came to Sorbonne, I actually presented my dissertation research. I did my PhD at the University of Notre Dame, focusing on the experiences of immigrant Muslims. And while I was doing the research, I got interested in Muslims in China. And of course, all of these discussions have been framed as part of this global migration wave, from China to the United States and from the rest of the world to the North America. But then I got the opportunity to come to teach here in 2009. That really changed my understanding of global migration. So I feel that, my perspective during the time I was doing my dissertation was much narrower than the perspective that I have learned, have gained actually in the last 10 years working here in the Gulf region. So this is where I come from, and today I'm really excited to again talk about the topic that had me actually spend almost 10 years on. When I first came here, I didn't actually think about studying Chinese in Dubai because everyone was telling me there's nothing to study. When I discuss this topic, and then, people say, there are Chinese, but they're just here for money, nothing else. They come and then, they set up their business, and they don't even learn the language very fast. And then, of course, they're not interested in Arabic, right? So this is the common stereotype about China and Chinese people. And then the only thing we know at the time was Dragon Mart. So there's very little knowledge about this community. And honestly, I was discouraged, so I didn't really think too much about the research, right? let alone a project on this community. But in the years after Arab Spring, and especially after 2013, when the Belt and Road Initiative was proposed, we start seeing this transformation in terms of the bilateral relations. It's no longer just about business transactions, something so superficial, meaningless, right? There has been more interesting exchanges on the ground level. So from the government perspective, right, we have the strategies and they wanted to promote and then push in the region, but then on the ground you have very dynamic population there, and they're here for different reasons. And so that actually got me back right into studying the Chinese in Dubai, their experiences. So just a little bit shamelessly promote my book. And since the book came out during the pandemic, right? It was not a good time to publish the book because nobody will see it in print. Many people who are interested in the study or have been following my research asked for a copy, but then of course I direct them to the ebook, right? So anyway, so the book is here in my hand. I don't know if you have this in the library, but then my library actually at the American University of Sharjah. That's okay. Okay, so they have a copy. Now, I'm saying that because this is really a moment, I think, not just from academic interest, but also to generate that kind of interest in a broader, academia to kind of, rethink, China's engagement with this part of the world, right? Whether it's worth reading, I'll leave that to you. But then today I'm going to talk a little bit more about various topics that I have been paying attention to, and I'm going to offer a bit more general sort of overview of the Chinese expatriate community. And then there are many ways to approach them, of course, as an academic subject. And then there are also other interest groups who are eager actually to have conversations with me from time to time, consulting firms, investments, agencies. It just got these, really interesting inquiries from time to time. And somehow, right, even though China has been developing, right, the bilateral relations with the UAE, it seems that we've reached this very interesting time, and the pandemic and obviously has changed many things. We also wonder, right? Are the Chinese coming back? And then so for 2 years, you have not seen any Chinese here. I mean, tourists in terms of tourists, right? And so are they going to come back, right? What is going to happen in the future? Is the Chinese community going to grow? Are they going to have long-term plans here? Are they going to, have more meaningful engagement? And are they going to participate in the society more actively like others? So these questions are I think are the future research directions. And then so I'm going to open with an overview of a history of Chinese migration into the Arab Gulf, just to give you a little bit historical background, to see that, the existence of Chinese here in the UAE is not a exceptional phenomenon. It's not, it's part of this flow that began to arrive actually in the late 19th century, and it has continued throughout time. And there has been different forces and factors that pull and push these people to this region. Some things have changed, but then there are also a lot of things that have not. So we just wanted to start from here. So this is basically my own kind of summary. So through my readings of studies, and which are not really about China, but about other migrants into the region, and also historical records, and then the archives that has been studied by historians, and then so sort of identified these 4 waves of Chinese into the region, broadly speaking. So in the 19th century, late Qing dynasty, until 1949, when the People's Republic of China was established, and we actually saw this wave of Chinese actually settle down in Saudi Arabia. And this is a history that most people don't know. And now recently, I can actually share with you, even though I mean the author is a friend of mine, she's actually publishing articles, and then hopefully her book will come out, and it's about the Chinese Muslims in Saudi Arabia, the settlements and then they established there, and then how they have actually helped China and the Chinese interest actually to continue grow in Saudi Arabia. Very interesting study indeed. So that was the first wave, and then we had actually a large number of Uyghurs from Xinjiang during the time, and they sought a safe haven in Saudi Arabia, and because of the turmoil in that part and during the Qing dynasty. And then during the Republican era, we continue to see this trickle of people into Saudi Arabia because of pilgrimage. So people who found their ways, to cross the borders during that very difficult time, and then to make pilgrimage to Mecca, and then they decided to stay. Right, so that was actually the sort of the earliest period that we could trace back to. These people actually, even though they're very small, but they've actually played important roles as a middleman, as intermediary between the Saudi society and then China. And then after actually 1949, especially after 1980, you start seeing these people playing a bigger role. That's something that I think will deserve some attention. So the second wave actually, based on my sort of conceptualization, span from 1949 until early 1970s. And of course, this is something interesting about studying a particular ethnic group, because you can never actually just focus on that group alone. They never live in a vacuum. So you have to think about what is happening in the region, right? And of course, you're familiar with the history in the region, what happened during the time. So in that period of time, of course, China was mostly locked down, so you won't see Chinese coming out of mainlands. But then there's a migration of Chinese Muslims from Taiwan, for example, to Saudi Arabia, and you have business people from Taiwan and Hong Kong who would actually go to Yemen in the Gulf of Aden. They would actually do business there, right? And then of course things will change in the early 1970s. Because anti-British insurgency there. So people start moving northward to Dubai. So that's when, we start seeing this kind of change, and Dubai become more important, and then UAE as a whole became more important. So that's why, you also see that Chinese together with others who would find their ways into Dubai. The third wave starts in the 1970s, of course, and then would actually extend into 1990s. And this is when the Gulf countries start establishing diplomatic relations with China, right? UAE was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first Gulf countries that established diplomatic relationship with China. It was 1984, right? So you start seeing, more Chinese business people, because it was easier to come here, and then they have consular protection. They could seek out help if there's something wrong, right? If they encounter various sort of, situation. So that was the time when you start seeing this kind of adventurous business people came to Dubai, and then Kuwait was an important center as well. Okay. But at least we have two small screens here. Now the Gulf War actually would actually really sort of push the Chinese into Dubai from Kuwait. So that's the third wave. If we have more time, we can talk more about that. And then after 2000, I think this is something that more relevant to you now. Many of you probably, especially, students of Professor Cleo, born after 2000, I'm sure, right? So this is time you start seeing all kinds of people here in Dubai, right? China or Chinese, they're not unique. There are so many foreigners. And we know the population has grown in the UAE exponentially in the last 2 decades. And then we've seen, especially Dubai became, the center of global trade, financial activities, transportation, and so on. So that's one of the reasons, of course, for the Chinese to come here. But on the other hand, right, you also wanted to understand why there is such push there. In 2001, China joined WTO, the World Trade Organization. Right. A little bit before that, 1999, the Chinese government already talking about, investing outside China. Right. So this is something referred to as a going out strategy. It sounds very simple, but it's actually a grand strategy at the time. It was reaffirmed and re-articulated and refined in 2000. And so it was actually after that time, that period, you start seeing more Chinese companies coming here. And then these companies were different from the companies who settled down here, actually opened their branch offices in the 1990s. Those companies were state-owned enterprises. But after 2000, what you saw actually are the small to medium businesses, right? So that's the sort of a very brief overview of this different waves of migration into Arabian Gulf. But of course, the beginning was mostly Saudi Arabia, but now it is Dubai. So give you a little bit statistics just to put this into perspective, right? Now in Saudi Arabia right now, if you're counting, we have about 40,000 to 60,000 people actually from mainland China. And if you're adding the Turkish, the Uzbeks, and then the Uyghurs, and then so who went to Saudi Arabia from China, right? The population actually is very large, about 150,000, right? But this is still much smaller than the size of Chinese community here in the UAE. The number that we have in 2018, the embassy actually, the consul general made a speech on her exit, right, from the term she served here. She said there were 270,000 Chinese in Dubai alone at the time. And of course, the population fluctuates, but then it really caught everyone's attention. Because every time I meet with people, they ask me, how many Chinese here? I know French populations quite large compared to other Western expatriate communities. It's a number 2, I think. And then first is the British, and then the French, and then the Americans actually quite small, like 50,000 or something. So when people hear that there are so many Chinese, and they're usually surprised. But then it's not surprising because you can see them everywhere. You quickly notice that they tend to concentrate, right? So maybe the story is the same. Right, Chinese will go to these large cities and then they will establish ethnic neighborhoods and ethnic business, and so that's the end of the story. Is that true? And of course, I think there's more to tell than just stick to the old tale, right? So I'm going to now share a little bit more with you about my research on Chinese community. Now here, I call this Dubai's Chinatowns. This is an old model, of course, you hear a lot about Chinatown, you watch Jackie Chan movie. Everywhere, when we talk about the Chinese diasporic communities, you think about the Chinatowns, right? This is very common, actually. These are the ethnic neighborhoods, ethnic enclaves, right? But then this type of formation, again, it actually helps us to understand how business grow in the Gulf region and how we can understand Dubai's urbanization process. So it's not something that would actually just end here. I actually had a fancier circles here to show you where the Chinatown is, but then I think this is not showing me. So I'm going to just show you where the Chinatowns are. Okay, so for people who are familiar with this area, this is Dera, right? Knife Souk, right? That area was actually a highly concentrated, ethnic neighborhood for the Chinese. And this was actually considered the old Chinatown. People came in the 1980s, right? And they set up shops there. They also leased out these large buildings. And you probably have seen, it's called the China Shoe City, but it's really old now. Nobody would go there anymore. Since 2005, okay, everyone shifted to International City. It's right there, that map over there, right? International City, and everyone's familiar with that, and they would go shopping. That shopping mall is actually the largest commodities trade center outside China. It has thousands of shops, and in 2015 alone, it registered 10 billion dirhams, net trade volume. So it's actually quite amazing. But this area, it's also became, the ethnic enclave, right? People who work in drug marts, then you have the owners, right? You have the workers. So you have this very interesting mixing of population there. Because of convenience, you have millionaires actually living in international city. They choose to, and they have kids, and then so they like to surround their kids with, their in this culture, right? They have friends living there. So then on the other hand, you have the working class, but they do mingle. They shop in the same place, and then so that's something interesting. So you will see this hierarchy within the Chinese community, but then you also see this kind of on daily basis, this kind of interactions, and so that is something that I looked into. I found that very intriguing. Now, in the area that would actually again have high concentration of Chinese would expand from the international city and to Silicon oasis, actually, and you might wonder why. That again have to do with this convenience location of Silicon oasis, the residential community. Many Chinese business people would actually purchase their houses there. And so, gradually you start seeing this kind of very clearly shaped and formed these, enclaves. But then what about engagement, right? So you wonder, they just, surrounding themselves with other Chinese, and then how do they engage? And then do they actually care for that? So that's, on one kind of the story that, I tell in my book, but then not quite a lot, is about money. I think that's something that we find is so obvious. You have to talk about it, right? A lot of people come to Dubai for business, and now, of course, to save money is a simplification of their, their goals, right? But then this is just one way to kind of describe this low-end globalization, what's happening. This was something that discussed very carefully by Professor Matthew Gordon at on Hong Kong University in his study on what is happening in Hong Kong. I found that, again, of course, very similar here in Dubai, but a little different, okay? Because now the Chinese are the expats, are the migrants here, and they also serve a lot of other people who are quite noble, right? Yet it's still low-end globalization. What does it mean by low-end globalization? The commodities were mostly low-end commodities, right? Textiles, small commodities, toys, and then, you name it. And then, so they're not really high-tech, right? This is the story that most people pay attention to, right? And that, if we're really looking at that, we can frame this as a south-to-south migration. So China, even though it's the second largest economy in the world, but the income gap is huge in China, and GDP per capita, and if you're looking at that, China ranked very low, right? So we're actually looking at south-to-south migration, and then you have these small traders, merchants. They're not necessarily well educated, right? So they're here to try their luck, right? But then gradually start seeing things change, and then now in the south-to-south migration, we do see ghettoization. You start having this enclaves, and of course it's anchored by Dragon Marts in the international city. If you have time, you can go, but I heard from my students, they always say, I don't want to go there. There are a lot of urban legends about it, right? That actually shows that social distance. People don't know each other who share the urban space in Dubai. That's another aspect I delved into. Okay, so look at the images here, just wanted to point out, and then you're familiar with Dragon Marts. I have anecdotes here. The dragon, right? If you actually go there, it doesn't look so shiny, especially if you've been here for a long time. This has been repainted. If you were here for a long time, if you still recall, maybe had a photo of Dragon Marts several years ago, it was actually a dark dragon, right? But if you read a little bit more about Chinese understanding of dragon, and the dragon cannot be dark because a dragon is a sign of power, right? It's auspicious. Yet in the Western understanding of dragon, it's an evil, right? So you have this very interesting change, and now the dragon has been repainted, and so it's gold. So it looks much better. Very interesting. That's something I noticed. I don't know if many other people noticed that. So this is a Dragon Mart, and inside, Dragon Mart right here, you have Confucius, this mural, a very large one. I heard actually when they first put Dragon Mart together, they wanted to open this up to everyone from the Confucius civilizational zone. I didn't want to make it specifically Chinese. But then again, this is the force of global commodity market and global labor migration. So eventually this is a Chinese space. But then within the Chinese space, now you know that people hire workers, shopkeepers who come from different backgrounds. Do they actually interact, right? How do they deal with each other? It's something that I have not really looked into. This could be a very interesting research topic for those of you who are interested in urban sociology, to look at, how the owners, the Chinese owners, interact with their employees, whether they come from South Asia or Africa or the Philippines. And I've heard actually Chinese businessmen or businesswomen say that they don't want to hire Chinese because all the Chinese are too ambitious. You can never keep them for more than 3 years because they want to become bosses as well. So they hire others because other people tend to be content with whatever they have. This is something I find quite interesting because now the status of Chinese, are they really migrants from the South, right? Are they as privileged as people who has Western passports? Just recently, I read a book with huge interest, very interesting. It's written by a French sociologist. Her name is Amélie Renard. She published a book called Western Privilege. I think I keep making these comparisons between her research and mine. I think it's very interesting to see where the Chinese are standing right now. In my book, I talk about frontier mentality. What I found is that the Chinese community feel quite empowered, actually, especially in the last 20 years. They felt because of the takeoff of Chinese economy has given them actually that kind of vantage point. And there's also a very strong national pride, right? And that made them actually feel they're really exploring. They are, the entrepreneurs. What they're trying to do is that, they're actually trying to open up something new. So they are on the frontier of the Chinese universe, and they're trying to make a statement. So they're not just here to make money, actually, for especially the younger generation. They're actually creating a new niche where, they are much more capable of operating, of navigating that space. And then, so they're doing something new other than, these commodity trade. I think what's more important for future study would be looking at these, social media celebrities, bloggers, right? Those other tech startups, and also, some of these producers of content, creative content, and who are Chinese and who are very much integrated in the global environment, global context, right? So that really breaks down this stereotype about China being, or here, being a dragon mart. It's much bigger than dragon mart, but we don't see that, right? Well, I know I don't want to actually, spend the whole time, right, giving you, a lecture about my research. So I want to be brief, and I wanted to move on to more discussions, more interactions, so we can come back, explore more of these, topics in greater depth and in more details. So now, in my study, actually, what I have seen is that, there is this kind of gradual shift of the Chinese communities actually from margin to mainstream. Why do I say that, right? Is that an exaggeration? What I've noticed is that, the multinational corporations, they're growing here, right? But of course, these are Chinese multinational corporations. Now we're talking about the Huawei, for example. And despite the US sanctions on Huawei, they're still growing, and then they're offering alternatives, and very, very attractive alternatives. And that's, well, that has attracted customers. And then there are also other multinational corporations. Ali Cloud is operating here. We have construction companies, and then we have other high-tech communication companies. And so they all operate actually in that space. And then this becomes a very important foundation actually or the launchpad, I would say, for these companies, and to expand into other markets in Africa and the Horn of Africa, or, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the rest of Middle East, and then some even use this actually to reach out to Central Asia, right? So this is the role of multinational corporations. But does this just repeat the stories of other multinational corporations? To some extent, but then of course, there's a state intervention there, right? It seems that, Chinese multinational corporations are more closely connected to the state than what the multinational corporation should operate in the mind of the free market economy, right? So can we actually completely separate state from this business operations? That's something else, I think that would deserve more research. Research development, people like me, it's quite rare. And when I came here, it was just, I was just like this rare species, and I'm still actually the absolute minority on my campus. There are only 4 East Asians actually at American University of Sharjah, unfortunately. I'm one of them. So, in terms of research and development, then we see more actually researchers here in Abu Dhabi. So I think, since I'm focusing on Dubai, but I think, comparative studies of Dubai's approach and Abu Dhabi's approach could also be useful. You'll see more research efforts, projects, and being expanded actually right here in the capital. Now, social cultural exchange is also growing. These exchanges didn't exist, and then the only kind of exchange that you're familiar with are these performance on stage. Right? If we think that is a cultural social exchange, I think that will be really a bit too superficial, right? People come here, put on a show, and then everybody liked it, and then claps, and then that's the end of this. I think that is an initial stage, of course, but there will be more social cultural exchanges, and such as language programs, right? And then, the pop culture and Korean wave had more impact here in the UAE, right? But Chinese pop culture has not actually had that kind of reach here. Will this change? But of course, that has to do with the state's role in the pop cultural industry in China, right? So the Chinese entertainment is just not very attractive because the state has a very strong hand actually on top of all these content development and then the transmissions. Now, community building and social engagement is something that I think would be really would be really interesting to look at. The Chinese community actually are becoming more permanent, I would say, right? So just like any other communities here in Dubai and even in the entire UAE, the immigration policies is changing. I know a lot of Chinese have received the 10-year golden visa. So now they actually have a stake here. They want to invest more. And one thing that they need to do, of course, is to come out of the ethnic neighborhood to really play a role in the society. So charity is one thing that they've been doing. And a lot of these charitable events have been organized actually by the Chinese Muslim community here. And in my blog and in some of my articles, I actually had detailed discussions about the roles Chinese Muslims play in this region, because there's social capital and a cultural capital. So that's one of the things that I will show that there's really sort of a shift from margin to the mainstream, the shift from a market and to the multicultural, cosmopolitan stage of Dubai. So people are actually doing more now because they're also enabled by their educational level, their language skills, and their professional prestige. So yes, there's some sort of prestige there now in the Chinese community, which would allow them to engage and to feel more comfortable to play a role. But again, that is just the beginning of this. Most of the population still focus on business, focus on their little world, right? There's much less about reaching out and integrate and engage. And finally, right, before I end this, my part, and then to open the floor for questions, I just wanted to point out some of these topics that could be of interest to students and to colleagues here. Of course, there has been a lot of research about, what happened during COVID time. we know COVID actually had a huge impact on your study. Today, I just deal with many students complained about grades. I don't know if you received that request here. Of course not. Right? But then, in terms of the relationships between China and the UAE, we've also seen these changes. And this is what, my title, we talk about the new era. I think the new era, there are several meanings. First, you might want to think about the Belt and Road Initiative era, right? Since 2013. You can think about 2018 when China and the UAE upgraded their bilateral relationship to comprehensive strategic relationship and partnership, or you think about COVID. I think, I'm actually thinking about the post-COVID time. Not there yet, not quite, especially from the Chinese perspective, but it will be over. And that's my take, right? So what is going to happen? Right now, what we've seen is that, China has remained a very, very important trade partner to the UAE. China was still the top trade partner actually last year. This year's number is not out, data is not out, but I still think, the volume, the trade volume will remain quite impressive. Research, right? We have more scientists here and more collaborative projects here. Education, UAE has introduced Chinese language courses, right? And in public schools, how is that going to change the kind of perception, right, among the local population, Emiratis toward China? That is another opportunity we can see. And in terms of cultural exchanges, right, more than just these shows on stage, could there be more discussions, more interaction between the intellectuals, for example? Talk about the compatibility, for example, between or the conversation or dialogue actually between Islam and Confucianism. This has been done actually in the West, but can we do that here? Can we have that kind of very meaningful dialogues and to build some kind of common ground for China and the UAE, and to kind of, to really integrate with each other at a cultural level, right? But then we have here, you cannot see here, it's challenges. Three things that I have seen so far, right? Because of COVID, there has been a reshuffling of Chinese capital and investments. Business people are very sensitive to these changing currents. So they're quickly moving out of certain businesses and, entering new ones. This is something that I've been actually observing, I've been following recently. Domestic cross-border crimes. We don't hear much about that. It's not quite in the news, but in the Chinese community, there are platforms, right, to share this information. And yes, there's actually been more crimes, both domestic crimes within the community and cross-border crimes. And then the Chinese are both victims and perpetrators, right? So it's happening on different levels. This is something that can change the attitude, right, of the UAE government toward the Chinese community. And there might be, greater control, or it'll be more patrol actually in this ethnic neighborhood. And then we also have this problem with digital economy, cryptocurrency, for example. And the UAE has, a very open, liberal attitude toward it, but not in China, right? Not in many other places. So you can imagine in recent years, we've seen the influx of, these cryptocurrency dealers, entrepreneurs coming to the UAE and developing their enterprises here, and how this is going to affect the UAE-China relations. And those are the things that in the community and people are talking about. So as a sociology, I keep tracking these current events and then following what is happening in the community. So I'm hoping that there will be a second book, a revision of the book published in 2020. It might take longer time to see some of these trends actually really, have an impact on the community, but I'm hoping that there will be more interest actually on this community. But of course, before I end, I wanted to emphasize, I'm not building a case here to argue exceptionalism, okay? It is not. The Chinese community, very much like any other communities, in the diaspora, they're facing very similar challenges and have a lot of, very similar internal dynamics. So a lot of these conversations will have in a comparative perspective. So we look at, the experiences of South Asian communities, for example, look at, communities from Europe and Africa from other places. So I think it's not an exceptional case of its own, but then it does actually open up a lot of conversations. And it also helped to make a contribution to the theories on global migration. That's something that I didn't mention here, but then when I take your questions, and I might be able to touch upon that. And so with that, thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation. And then I'm very happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Sure.
So thank you so much, Dr. Yuting, and I will have maybe the privilege maybe to catch the mic just for one question, and then I will leave it to you. I don't know where to sit that it's comfortable for you. I'll just go here. So I was wondering if you can tell us more maybe about the differences that we might have between Dubai and other global cities for the Chinese community, if there is any significance. So you mentioned the Chinatowns or the district, but I think it's quite also different maybe in the way it's built, or maybe even it's thought by the other inhabitants. I don't know if the people in Dubai see it as Chinatowns. And also maybe more globally, largely in the sense of the demographics or the way they also see their life in the country compared to, I don't know, New York, London, or Paris.
It's a great question. When I was in the field, I met people, and then some of them will say, China is so much better than everywhere now, especially if you come from Shanghai. And those are very honest conversations. And there is actually a very strong sense of pride. We must admit, because China has evolved so significantly in the last 2 decades, and I stopped actually following this urban, development, because, you get overwhelmed, right? Every time I go visit China, you'll be surprised by how much they've built. So Dubai, to some of them, actually seem to be just an ordinary place, right? And then they do compare Dubai to Shanghai because they do see similarities, right? It's very actually something that they talk a lot about. It's the culture is very tolerant. The context is very tolerant, and so that's something that they like. But then for other people, they actually do think Dubai gives a lot of advantages. So we have very mixed opinions about Dubai. Now, about the differences between Dubai and other cities, other global cities. I would say it's actually, it's interesting to look at this, because in other global cities, right, we have historic Chinatowns. Well, it's just in those Chinatowns were established in the 19th century, especially in North America, in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles, San Francisco. You have this traditional, the historic Chinatown, ethnic space. So you have this settled, you have this established institutions there to kind of, to help people make translations. But these institutions have also actually been quite provincially based. So the language, for example, you hear in San Francisco is mostly Cantonese. But then Dubai is a new place. You don't have that historical Chinatown. Everything has been built from ground, basically in the 2000s. Especially if you look at, the international city, look at the Dragon Mart, this is recent development. So most people actually come to Dubai from mainland China. You will find those kind of differences in terms of the demographics. So what are the differences? And of course, the political system. So for people who left China in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and they experienced a China that is so different from the earlier generations, earlier waves of migrants to North America. in the 19th century during the Republican era. So I think those are the most important differences that we can see. So the transition now has been actually facilitated, I think, in a very interesting way by Chinese Muslims, because they are the ones who have the language skills and also cultural capital, because their religious backgrounds, to help that transition. And some of those most prominent individuals in the Chinese community in Dubai right now are Chinese Muslims. Many of them actually came in the 1980s as translators. They work for the government, so they understand how things work. So I think that would make the Chinese community very different from other communities in North America, right? Because you will not see Chinese Muslims play such visible roles anywhere else. So this is something that have interested me actually for many years.
So we'll take questions from the audience. I will try also to give time for the audience online, but let's start with.
Thank you so much. I'm one of Professor Cleo's students. This is quite fascinating, but I wanted to know a little bit more about the actual people in the community. So if you can maybe tell us a little bit more about their experiences and their opinions of Dubai, of other communities, of their own interactions and the reasons they stayed on. Because from what I understood, they came in different waves. So I would like to know more about even the industries that they're in. So I would just like to know more, yes, their demographic background, but also a little bit more about their opinions and their experiences and the reasons for remaining in Dubai. And would that be kind of something that they are aspiring to do long-term as well?
Okay, that is actually my own research questions, so something that I wanted to find out. And so now I think any sort of prediction will have to take into considerations of these pull and push factors in terms of the longevity, resilience of these migrant communities. It depends on the local policies, and then the global economic environment, and then the Chinese policies as well. So now for people here, Chinese people here in the UAE, in Dubai in particular, I think what made them stay longer is again primarily economic, right? So economic opportunities are the biggest pulling factors, right? They have been pulled actually to this region because they see the future, right? They see the ability for them to thrive. If this doesn't exist anymore, then I won't actually, be surprised that people will start leaving. So that's why, my book, the first part, actually deals with money. It is a very pragmatic issue, right? So you start seeing this population movement, and then people would leave and go. But again, everything has to be understood in in perspective. So if the economic opportunities are not as good as before in Dubai, for example, but then there's no other options, they will still continue to stay. But then another thing that made the Chinese wanted to stay here more is because it's really a middle point, sort of, between China and then the West. It's an interesting spot. Give you a very, a recent example. I've been studying second generation Chinese expats here in the UAE, and making comparisons between those who live in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Al Ain and Sharjah and so on. For the kids, actually, the younger generation, they think this is the best place to be because they are more advantaged than those who grow up in North America, Canada, United States, because they have been exposed to a totally different culture, and the Arab culture, Islamic culture. They found that very intriguing, even though they may not be so committed to studying Arabic. It's difficult, but they enjoy this kind of atmosphere. So I think, as the longer people stay here, especially for the younger generation, right? They'll develop this kind of tendency to engage in more long-term plan. So the first generation have been here, and we can go back to 1980s, especially, you know, here in the UAE. And then the second generation, the oldest person that actually I've interviewed is in his late 20s. So he grew up here. So that generation, sort of late 20, early 30, that's the oldest of the second generation. So if you're comparing with South Asian communities, very young, right? Don't have a lot of children grow up here. So they would go study overseas in UK, in the United States, but now they're back. They're all back here. So I think, you know, the UAE actually has been a magnetic place, at least, you know, for the last 2 decades for the Chinese for many reasons. Economic reason definitely there. But then you also have this cultural advantage there, and then they start feeling that. Not so, you know, significant among the older generation, but definitely something that the younger generation is thinking about. But I know you ask many other questions, right? It will be a long story to tell. There's so many different kind of people. Some are here for a very short time. Some have been here for a very long time. And so if I wanted to answer that very briefly, I will say that, you know, I think, again, there's no exceptionalism here. The Chinese community, again, also shaped, right, by various factors, you know, race, ethnicity, social class, and gender. And of course, you know, for the Chinese, you also have the religion and the state. And those are the issues that we talk about. So they have different plans. And the Chinese Muslims definitely have long-term plans. They find Dubai the best place. For others, they might think this as a very temporary place, as a stepping stone to other places. So I think they're very similar, actually, to others. So there is no uniform path, you know, for the Chinese community. It's very divergent. I hope that to some extent answer your question, but
Thank you.
it
Thank you
will
so much.
require longer discussion probably.
Thank you very much for your presentation. To follow up the previous question, I have, okay, you speak about the Chinese community, about the Chinese diaspora, but I would expect that this diaspora, as you've just mentioned, is very diverse. And I was just wondering whether we can speak about one Chinese diaspora, or whether we can not, I mean, even if we don't go into the details at the individual level, but at least you mentioned, for example, and I think that was really fascinating, the role of Muslim Chinese. Are there, I mean, Muslim Han, are there, what exactly Muslim communities well, the diaspora in Dubai, are they structured by communities already existing in China, or are they restructuring and reimagining community in diaspora? I would like to know a bit more about that, and perhaps also a bit more about your methodology. You mentioned that you are conducting interview. Can we know a bit more about, for example, how you select the interviewers and what kind of interview you conduct? Thank you very much.
Thank you for these 2 questions. So I was talking about one diaspora. I think the answer is no, because there's a huge diversity there. So the desires and then the plan, you know, and then the cultural practices of Chinese Muslims, for example, distinguish them significantly from other Chinese. But here, I think, you know, there are several things that we need to talk about, right? When we actually look at religion, obviously Chinese Muslims stand out. They really form this diaspora kind of community here because they have long-term plan here. They are tied to Chinese Muslims inside China. They're tied to, you know, Chinese Muslim communities in Malaysia, in California, and in Istanbul, for example. So, and in Saudi Arabia, apparently, right? So they are very much connected. So that's by religion. And yet, you know, social class is another very important factor. So within the Chinese Muslim community, you have the more affluent ones, high income ones, more successful ones, right? And then you have these, you know, people who are of low income, struggling, really trying to survive in a new place. And it's the same in the non-Muslim Chinese community. So I think social class is, has a very important role to play. So the upper class, well-educated ones, for example, they work in global 500, the Fortune 500 companies, right? And then you have these, small merchants, traders. So their lifestyles and the circle of friends will be quite different. So they operate in different worlds, but they do converge. I think that's something that, we still have a Chinese community. That's because, right, there is a strong cultural bonds there that can cut across these other lines. So those are at least, the kind of divisions I could see. Now, about methodology. So for my book that was published in 2020, it was actually outcome of a multi-year ethnography, which ended actually with more than 60 interviews with individuals from different backgrounds. So I didn't do a random interview, of course, but I intentionally diversified the sample so that I can have small to medium business people, right? Both men and women. And I can have Muslims and non-Muslims. I can have long-term migrants and newcomers. So I can have people in different professional backgrounds. So that's the methodology for this book. The interview I mentioned right now for the second generation, and that's actually an open call on Chinese social media groups, and then asking the young generation, especially the high school students and the young adults, to participate. So far, I've done 15 interviews. Very interesting, very eye-opening. So I asked them to introduce their friends to me, and they have their group as well. They have WhatsApp group, right? This one person told me they have 70-some people in that group. So I hope that I can get to talk to many of them to kind of, to get a sense of, how the younger generation deal with this multicultural environment, and do they consider themselves Chinese to what extent, right? So this actually ties to this broader literature on migration, global migration, identity construction, and racism, right? And then eventually the discussion about Chineseness. How is that constructed in the diaspora? I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Yeah, you can hear me. Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I bought the digital version of your books during the pandemics, and I found it very interesting.
Thank you.
I don't even know if we have the same type of study for the French community in the UAE, which has been there for a longer period of time, but it would be a nice study to do. Of course, you focus a lot on Dubai, and as you mentioned, there have been a lot of development in Abu Dhabi as well. I will have two questions. The first one, what is the place of Chinese education in the UAE? I think you have a school in Dubai, but only it opened to you 2 or 3 years ago?
2020, September 2020,
yeah.
Just in the middle of pandemic.
And so Confucius Institute, because, in the French community, we are a lot into culture and education. We have a school, and the Japanese also had a school in Sharjah in the 70s. But for you, it's new, so it's interesting to see how the relationship develops through education. And the second point is that we've seen, and that's mostly Abu Dhabi now, developing a lot of relationship with China in different sectors. We've seen it during COVID with the vaccine. Many of us at Sinopharm, artificial intelligence, you are very present here. And while at the time, the UAE looked at the BRI project from distance, we've seen the UAE and China getting closer, and China developing actions through the UAE and Abu Dhabi. Mainly, there is a project to develop a fund in a DGM to compensate the RAN for projects in Africa. We've seen recently Saudi Arabia selling oil in Iran, so there are projects with the money. There are projects in the military. China has been a new entrant. Now you sell armaments in all the GCC countries. I've seen the US last week complaining because you sold ballistic missiles to Saudi. So there is a growing role of China into the region from the political part. And we have seen it. When I came in this country 16 years ago, China was not in the 10 biggest partner of the UAE. France was number 5. Now you're number 1, and France is number 12. So we've seen this present growing. So my question is, how do you see it moving forward?
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, because now, I mean, first let's talk about the bigger picture, and then we talk about, you know, more specific questions. I think the big picture is that China is definitely, you know, becoming more engaged in this region, and that's a strategic planning. You know, we talk about Belt and Road Initiative quite a lot since 2013. There's a lot of criticisms, but then there's a lot of questions and a lot of doubts. But then right now it's sort of, you know, in a hiatus, but it's going to reboot. I think, you know, especially after October, you will reboot, you know, what I'm talking about in China right now, election year. So that's a big picture. I think strategically, China is going to continue, right, strengthening its bilateral ties with the region. It's not just UAE. UAE is one of the states. So there's another level. I think, you know, we don't want to over exaggerate, right? Because China has interest in the region overall. So you often will see these contradictory policies, like, you know, China is, you know, working with Iran, China is working with Israel, China is working with UAE and all other countries. And then so what is China's position? I think, you know, for big states, obviously, right? You know, its strategic planning would always be, you know, different than smaller states. So that's at the state level. There's a lot of things that, you know, will reflect in how people on the ground make decisions. Like, you know, they will look at what is a viable field for them to go into. So I think, you know, for sociologists who are looking at what's happening on the ground, there's something that interests me. We hear things from the state media, and then we see things differently here. This, you know, this is something that, you know, it happens quite a lot. You see that, you know, the business decisions made in this region, and then you can actually start making connections to this bigger picture. It's always interesting to actually observe how the business people make decisions. They always have multiple plans. They are not putting all the, let's say, they're not putting all the eggs in one basket. And this is something that, you know, the Chinese business people do. So they are mobile, right? And they are also very pragmatic, right? So I think, you know, that is on the one level, the grand level, you know, the strategic plan, and then so you will see, we will see, I think, you know, that's bilateral relationship continue to strengthen, and China has actually stepped up as a top trading partner of the region, and this will continue. So that's one aspect. Now, the other aspect, right? I actually would, I kind of like, you know, forgot that the first question you asked is something, the education, yes. Sorry, I got carried away by the bigger picture. Now, the education, the school in Dubai, I don't know if you have heard about this school, opened in 2020, September. A lot of people thought it's not going to go because during a pandemic, it was very difficult to open anything new, but they did it, and it was actually a success. It is the first national curriculum school, actually supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by the government in general, outside China. China has not built any government schools outside China. Dubai is the first place. I think this speaks volume about the strategic planning. China does see this location, Dubai in particular, very important to its future strategic planning. So building a school would actually help to extend the longevity of the community. What makes the Chinese community very much sort of temporary, probably more than other communities, is that there's no school in Dubai for many, many years. There were actually business proposals, commercial plans, you know, just joint ventures, taking model from North America, from these private, you know, schools, very expensive ones, and then trying to come here, find a local partner, and then build this type of, you know, international school and offer international curriculum to the Chinese, but those plans didn't go. What actually worked this time is because the government was behind it. Any sort of short-term commercial investment is not going to do very well in, in terms of education. University of Sharjah University, or American University of Sharjah, actually is an investment of His Highness. We know that it has taken so many years to take off, right? So those business plan didn't work, but then the government plan worked. Right now, in 2020, I know that the enrollment was actually 183 or around that number. It's only for like, just a few grades. I think about 3 grades or whatnot. And now they have the primary school from year 1 to year 6. And it's commissioned actually to one of the best schools in Hangzhou, which is the headquarters of Alibaba, right? It's very close to Shanghai, about 2 hours drive from Shanghai. It's the best school. So, you can imagine if the Chinese community value education so much, right? They would actually be happy to send their children to the school and then seek to stay here on a long-term basis. So they don't have to send their children to other places. They'll be comfortable staying here. But now, and does that actually mean there will be more cultural exchanges, engagement? Not yet, because this school is for Chinese. It doesn't cater to others, right? So basically, the Chinese are sending their kids to school so that they can make easy transfer if they want, right, back to China. In the past, it was not possible. Now they can, right? So you actually attract more Chinese people to come here, invest, and then in case they want to leave, they can have an easy exit plan. So that's the project, right? And now Confucius Institute is a very different, different institution, have a very different configuration here. And there has been a lot of criticism toward it in North America. Many Confucius Institutes have been closed or suspended. But here in the UAE, the Confucius Institute have been quite resilient. We know there are 2 Confucius Institutes here, one in Abu Dhabi, one in Dubai, and this is exceptional actually. In the UAE, we've not seen actually 2 Confucius Institutes in 2 cities so close by, right? That institute actually focus a lot on cultural exchanges, interactions. They provide language lessons for non-Chinese language learners, right? So I think maybe the Confucius Institute will have greater role to play, but then we'll see what the Chinese school can do. I think as they become more established, as the enrollment increase and as their reputation grow, they might be able to attract non-Chinese students, and that is when real interactions will take place, where children will have a more immersive experience with Chinese culture. But that's yet to come. Yeah. Actually, I've been doing a little bit, data, collecting here on how many Chinese language institutions operating here, in Dubai. In fact, in 2009, there was only 2. 2, yeah, probably just 1, because the other one was really just, a beginning enterprise, startup. But now you have at least 10. You can see that kind of growth. All of these businesses are actually doing very well. They can sustain themselves, right? So the market is definitely growing, and it's just a matter of 13 years right now. So I think there is demand. Definitely, there is interest. Yeah.
We take your question, and then we'll take one question from the online. Okay.
Sure. Thank you. Firstly, I'm so impressed with your immersion in the field, because I'm a British PhD student as an ethnographer as well. And my topic is the lived experiences of second language learners. So like the gentleman mentioned about education, I'm just curious to know, what are the intergenerational changes you've seen? Because there's so many generations that you yourself are interviewing. You've got this group of 70 young people. And although I think, yes, you are very, very nationalistic, but outside the field of the school, Chinese students are still going to be interacting with a global culture. So is that not spilling into, and is the cultural capital and the social capital moving in a different direction as the generations migrate to the UAE?
I think there's probably, I need to clarify one thing first. Now the Chinese school we're talking about, they only have primary school age groups. So, we're talking about younger children. So this is interesting to observe because I don't study them, but I think this is going to have some sort of impact, right? These young people that I interview, those who are in high schools, the young adults, postgraduates, for example, who grew up here, they grew up in international schools. All of them actually grew up as the minority, almost probably the only one in their year group, and then one of the few in the entire school. So they are totally immersed in this international environment. Again, here's a social class and religion. So for the Chinese Muslims, they prefer to send their children to schools that offer strong Arabic language program and consider more religious. Okay, so they are interested in that aspect. Now, among the non-Muslim Chinese families, again, based on their income level, some of these kids will go to the best high schools like Dubai College, very expensive, very has a great reputation. And then you have these middle income, low income. The low income will actually send their children home to China because they really cannot afford. Now the middle income will keep their children here. They'll try their best to send their children to schools that they can afford. But many actually chose less costly schools. And in those schools, right, then students will mingle more with people of their own socioeconomic statuses and then so on. So this again ties to the hierarchies in Dubai. Unfortunately, we don't want to reinforce the stereotypes, but I have seen that you have Chinese students, or especially the families, trying very hard actually to put their children in schools that have better reputations and then supposedly, more superior academic standards, right? So that would actually keep them together with more the Western children or children with Western passports. And then the Arabic, the schools that have better Arabic programs tend to cater to Arab expats. And so, you see this very clear division. So for children who grow up in international schools, they are more, I would say they are more, they have bigger plans for future. They wanted to go far away, right? But what makes those students who grow up in this Arabic intensive environment is that they actually get to see the life of the majority here. So their world is more down to earth.
Yeah.
And so, but then they actually now we can see at least two groups among these young people that I interviewed. In the international school, we call them international school, but we know the demographics are different, right? So like, Dubai College, American school in Dubai English speaking school, desk and so on. So this is one group. And then we have another group. It's interesting to see how religion and then social class, right, overlap. And then of course there are stereotypes, right? So the Chinese Muslim kids will go to these schools and then, not very good. And then other students will go to better schools. And then the parents, the Chinese Muslim parents, right, they also make these decisions. Should I emphasize on this or should I emphasize on that? So they're also torn. Right now, it's still at the beginning of the research. So I'm still sorting out these patterns, but I think this is just, fantastic for researchers to
the tensions
to
are very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we'll just take a question, I think, from the chat where we had two questions. One is, can you elaborate more on the international city Chinatown model and how it has the whole Chinese hierarchy yet ghettoized? How is it close to the classical ghettos, if we may say? There's the question on the screen if you want to. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that question. So in one of the chapters, I actually elaborated on the spatial characteristics of Chinese community here. And I talk about these two different kind of, ethnic communities there. One is the old, Chinese community that center around the existing markets, in Dira, the Naif, and then Moshe Bazaar over there. So that's one area. And then International City and Dragon Marts, and that's the face of China now, at least since 2005. So whenever I talk about the Chinese, right, talk about China, you think about Dragon Mart. Now, how did Dragon Mart become sort of a, the ethnic enclave? Or, how did this ghettoization take place? I think a lot has to do with the international city area. It's a structural issue. That has to do with the prolonged process of completing the project there. The area which was planned as really a multicultural space, right? With all these labels, like France and Russia, Morocco, China, and so on, turned out to be a low-income neighborhood, unfortunately. They've been doing a lot of work in recent years trying to improve the rent in that area. Again, it's very economically oriented, but if the construction was not done, right, and if the transportation or commute is very difficult, and so that place is not going to be desirable. So gradually, I think that is how this whole area became sort of ethnic neighborhood and also associated with low-income people. But then I did mention earlier that this also a very mixed area, because the bosses, the owners of these shops in Dragon Mart, they might have actually big houses in Dubai Hills, Emirates Hills, sorry, or the Springs, but then they also maintain the regular residents inside International City. It just has to do with convenience. They place such importance on their children's education. So these institutions open International City, like language center, Chinese language center, dance classes, music, after school, cram schools, all sorts of things being very convenient to them. So they chose to stay there. So on the weekend, they actually, in the summer, they will go to France for vacation. But during the school years, they stay in International City, right? So I think, if you go to International City these days, you will see these rampant, construction project going on. They're building better, grocery stores and better restaurants, and then, better apartments, and then they're catering to this, change, this kind of demographic there. It's a choice that they made and compromise they made. So that makes this whole, the ghetto, so-called, right, a little different. But then again, if, right, the educational institutions that could only afford and to open their, their offices or their business in International City now has a lot of clientele and can make a lot of money, and then can move out of that area, that will change, right? So they might be able to open something in Emirates Hills now, in Jumeirah, like other, expat groups, and then people will start moving away from International City. That has started to happen now, gradually. We start seeing people opening branches in JLT, right? That means, they don't have to live so close to International City, they can move away, right? So the economic, the social class or economic condition in that International City will change, right? But then again, there are so many factors, and I've seen that, Waymart is doing a huge project in International City. So the area is changing. It's giving a more sort of, the upscale kind of, that kind of vibe, right? So it's a remodeling of a previous enclave area. So, we're gonna see that to change. And then even though, the history is very short, but everything in Dubai happens fast. So we might be able to see that transformation happening very quickly. So a project that didn't grow very successful at the beginning, international city, now became a ghetto, right? And accommodating these, low income shopkeepers, but now, transforming itself into upscale, middle class or upper class neighborhood, and this can happen very quickly. If the economic, the growth engine is here to propel that kind of development.
Yes, I think there's some question in the back. I don't know where the mic. Sorry, I'm not a lazy moderator, but I just have to keep pressing the key. Sorry, I let you manage.
Hi, my name is Nof. I'm Dr. Clea's student. We all know that Chinese people are very, they have a big pride towards their culture and ethnicity. From your study, are they interested to integrate, big word, within the Emirati community, not the international? We all know we live in an international, I would say, country as an overall, but are they interested in the culture, UAE culture? Are they interested to be part of the community and maybe get married to an Emirati family, like part of the family, a part of the culture and the community? So I'm really curious to learn about that.
Actually, there's one person I profiled in my book, and she is Chinese Emirati. But I mean, of course, she's naturalized Emirati. She came here, she's very well known, so her story can be read in other places, and she's also very engaged, and then she's this kind of go-to person. And if you wanted to actually get into touch with the Emirati community, she came here in the 1990s, and she married an Emirati man. And she has her own business, and then she's very successful. And then she also, got her UAE UAE passport. Right? It's a very difficult process, according to her. And she had to answer a lot of questions because it's not a natural thing that will happen because of marriage. She had to actually show that she is really sort of, invested in this culture, and she has made a contribution to the society. And then her business success actually was one of the big factors. So she got the passport, and that made her a very important individual in the Chinese community because she can sponsor businesses. And now she came here as a translator. She studied Arabic. Her family is a Chinese Muslim family, so that made her even more unique, right? Now, other than this person, of course, other stories, and I've heard, and then, Chinese women married Emirati man and have children, and then sort of, they are the very few kind of, really like, what you refer to as integrated with the community, really kind of immerse themselves in the community. It's rare, I think. It's rare because a lot of people are interested, but they don't know how. There is no opportunity for them to meet any Emirati and then have real conversations, you know what I mean, right? And so they don't know how to get to know them, and then they're not in the same school. Most Chinese students will go abroad to study. If they had chosen to come to AUS, for example, to Sharjah or here Sorbonne, they would have the opportunity to meet, local Emirati students. But then since they made educational decisions, that would let them to go abroad. And so many of them don't. Now, the interesting thing is that the younger generation who are in middle school right now, more and more of them are thinking about staying here in the UAE. I think the COVID has made a huge impact on people's planning. And they feel that UAE is a safer place. And then they also talk highly about how UAE government has controlled COVID. They feel very comfortable here. And of course, all these discussions, and the media coverage about US has been very negative in China. exactly the same thing happening in the United States in terms of the image of China, right? So many people actually start looking at alternatives. And so UAE seems to be an interesting place. You can get American education or French education or British education in a very safe environment. So I think if they start actually making decisions to stay, and they'll be able to meet people, and then, you know, that actually might encourage more of these connections. But I think most Chinese would find it difficult because religion is another issue, right? That's, you know, would require a lot more investment. So far, I think there's, if we're speaking from a rational choice perspective, the cost is too high for the outcome. Yeah.
Question from Karim.
Hi. So my name is Reem. I'm also one of Dr. Cleo's students. So I actually work at Hayat Biotech, if you've heard of it. So it's a joint venture between CMBG China, so Sinopharm, and G42. So as you can imagine, we have 40% Chinese employees. For a long time, they actually were a lot more than the other Arabs, Indians, general Khalijis, and out of the Khalij Arabs. And I want to touch a little bit on the maybe more human aspect, and that's why I'm really happy with Nov's question as well. So for a long time, there was a bit of a difficulty to kind of integrate between our Chinese employees as well as the Arab, Indian, Pakistani, you know, the others that we've been working with each other for a long time. And difficulties came from not only language barrier or cultural barrier as a sense of not getting where the other was coming from, but actual cannot understand each other, because we had a lot of secondment employees come in. And I just wondered, that's why I'm glad with her question, the integration, especially in a business aspect where, for example, I would request something very simply via email and it's a lot of things would get misunderstood. So I wondered, I don't know if this touched on your research or not, but possibly what you foresee or what you would assume the difficulties would be that we're facing and how we can, because sorry, I'm just trying to find my sentence right now. Just kind of how you think the human element was or how it is, either business perspective or, no, I've already asked my second part, which was just in general life.
Yeah. Actually, that's an important question to ask, especially, you know, as Chinese business grow, right? And earlier also mentioned, you know, what's the relationship between, you know, Chinese business people or the Chinese bosses and then their employees, and then now in this setting, you know, and the employees among employees themselves, because it's a large company, so you have a very large staff. So what I have seen actually in my research is that, you know, and also, you know, through my readings of other studies on Chinese in Africa, a lot of this distrust, a lot of these tensions actually grow out of the lack of communication, effective communication, right? Now, many of these Chinese staff, especially the earlier generation, they were not global. And they never really experienced this global or multicultural environment when they grew up in China. And they were recruited from China. They went to college, of course, but then, you know, they come here from China. So, you know, this transition can be very difficult. And then they came with all sorts of misunderstandings or imaginations about a culture that seemed to be very remote to them, exotic, right? That's the right word, I think. And then, of course, you know, this also kind of, you know, entangle with those stereotypes, you know, prejudice, and then, you know, people have already. So it's going to take time for them actually to really understand how to communicate. Now, for the younger generation, however, if you are recruiting locally of this, you know, second generation, which are actually very small right now, many of them, you know, still sort of in the growing up period. But I think, you know, 5 or 10 years down the road, you're going to see more people who are more, you know, adapted during their schooling years, during their formative years. So that kind of communication that you mentioned, cannot really understand each other, not because you don't understand the words, but just the meaning, even just a joke, you can't understand a joke. You are joking, but then they feel offended, sort of thing like that, right? So I think that would really require the whole demographics change. That's again, that is what I think makes this study about the Chinese community important, because we're actually looking at this gradual change, gradual shift, and this will take many years to see the outcome. But if a Chinese community is here for longer term, if they have the desire to actually educate their children here, and if their children are more engaged, involved, and if, of course, the UAE educational institutions would actually improve their quality, right? So there is a greater reason for them to be here, and then that will contribute to that, better communication. Yeah, I think again, it's a communication issue, or the kind of vision that people have. A lot of these individuals that work in the companies, they have yet to actually develop that. But then what I can tell is that more and more people are exposed to this multicultural environment, and then more used to living or navigating a diverse environment. Yeah.
May I ask a follow-up?
Mhm.
So would you say, as generally speaking, both the Chinese community and as well as the Arab, or let's say UAE community, we both are very proud of our culture, of our
Yes.
So would you say that cause further maybe difficulties in integrating the two, because each of us,
Yes.
we don't it's not good to generalize, especially as sociologists, but generally.
Okay.
Dr.
Yeah, I mean, that's a comment actually I hear from time to time. People talking about the two civilizations, right? The Arab civilization, which is which had a glorious history past, and then very proud of itself, and then the Chinese likewise, right? So this is again, of course, something that you feel that it's very subtle, very nuanced. It's difficult to really sort of pinpoint, but then you get it, sort of thing, right? Yet I think the younger generation are not completely Arab or Chinese. They're not anymore. Like my daughter, she takes Arabic lessons, and then she listens to Korean pop music, and she has French friends, and then she has all the South Asian friends, and then she's in British school, but then she's probably gonna go to America for college. So people like her generation, they're not really tied to one thing. So I think that sense of pride will be much more diluted by the time these younger generation grow up. We already seen that in other global cities. So that's the reason why people think, people find it's really comfortable to live in London, to live in New York, Paris, because, the global cities are more tolerant, and then people are more dynamic. And, so Dubai ranked very high on various measures to, on the global city index, transportation wise, financial activity, and then everything. But of course, the cultural index is a bit low right now, right? We have a lot of cultural events and adventures and to bring people together, but to make that interaction really meaningful and really, happen, that will require the population itself, okay, have received that kind of dosage of multiculturalism to really operate, in this space. You're welcome.
I have another question, but I believe you sort of like answered it. It's around the young generation. So do they have any pride of being Chinese or not? That's one. Another question is, are they interested to know about the great Chinese history? And have they ever mentioned any, like, knowing the political climate, around China and the discrimination that some Chinese faces in other countries. Does that change any their perception of the future?
This is a question that we talk a lot about in the study of migrants, right? It's about identity construction. And if you are Indian, grew up, in the UAE or Canada, or United States, and then how do you identify your Indianness, right? And then so this actually again, applies in all other groups, and then we are interested in. So for the Chinese, and it's the same question they ask, what is China? Who are Chinese? Who am I? I think, those are the big questions they ask. And then for some of them actually grew up here. They are very much immersed in the Chinese environment. It has to do with their parents' connection with China. So if their parents are not globally educated and their profession would actually confine their everyday life within Dragon Mart, that kind of family, you see that and the children grow up in that kind of family, they will be much more rooted. So they understand what China is because they go back to China all the time. Everything's about China. And in the household, you have a lot of, Chinese, exposure to Chinese news and music and everything. So that's kind of China, that kind of family is more rooted. But then, you have other type of families, and then parents are very much encouraging, right? They interested to expose their children to other cultures. So I think, that immediate environment would change that. So it's again, this is why, when you ask me these questions, really give me ideas about, what questions I should ask again when I meet these kids, in the future. Because, these are very interesting dynamics there. It's hard to generalize. Yet as sociologists, we do like to create categories, we have this more pro-West families and pro-Arab families. But what I found, this one interesting interview that I had, right, with a kid who can actually speak Arabic fluently. And his Chinese is minimal compared to Arabic and English, right? So he's very rare. But I said, do people treat you differently in school? He said, no. Most people look at me as Chinese anyway. So, but because he could speak Arabic, he could understand local dialects, Egyptian, Lebanese, and so on, he could hear people talk behind his back, bad things, right? So, he actually had more insight of what's going on, but then he can actually encounter that. Sometimes he would just go, turn around, and then talk to people, and then, make them aware that they could actually understand. But most people don't have that kind of skill to really communicate and to correct stereotypes or, these biases. He had the power to do that. And of course, he doesn't do that all the time because boys sometimes can be quite unruly. So he doesn't want to trigger anything. He doesn't want to, provoke anyone. So, but then I think, through his narratives, I can feel that, these kind of layers, and they're really here. So for him, he's still Chinese, but then it's perceived by others. Internally, he doesn't feel that kind of connection to China. China is there. I have a family there, but then my future is here, really. But people don't accept me, right? So, and those are two different ways to define Chinese. One is, through the gaze, or the lens of outsiders, and one is internally, how they understand themselves.
Thank you so much.